Chapter 2. Team Dueling Hearts. Not too far away, the local park bustled with activity. 2 large playgrounds sat beside 3 large baseball fields, a tennis court, and a basketball court. Children scurried across them all, laughing and happy, their parents and friends rushing to keep up. The entire grounds was wrapped in a walking path leading right up to a thick line of trees that marked what appeared to be the park's furthest point. If one were to follow that path far enough into the tree line, though, they would find that the path continued through. It was overgrown and clearly in disrepair, but it was there. Walk it long enough and one would make their way through the trees to the old park, an area abandoned by the city but not by young fighters in the area. In the old park it was quiet. The bustle of the park proper was just far enough away to act as little more than background ambiance. The air smelled of grass and pollen. It was peaceful and free of distractions, and even though the city government had made an effort to provide out-of-the-way locations for fighters to have heart-to-hearts in recent years, there were none in the area yet. That's why soul wielders in the area wanting to test themselves would go regularly to the old park and fight each other. Some of them trained at one of the local dojos, others were self-taught. All of them came to the old park with the understanding that they would fight fair or be forced out by the other visitors. For that reason, it had been a while since anyone had caused any trouble, keeping to the local rule that the first fighter to fall even once lost the match. In the old park, upon one of 2 dilapidated basketball courts, a lanky young man stood ready to defend himself against an attack. He had messy red hair that stood up on his head and resembled a flame. An intense look passed over this young man's freckled face and sharp green eyes. His black tank top and red shorts left his arms and legs exposed, showing off scrapes and bruises from near-constant sparring and testing of his abilities. This young man was Paul Tucker, known as Tucker to his friends, and Pyro Tucker to everyone else. And in the old park, he was the guy to beat. Across from Tucker stood another young man about the same age, with medium-length brown hair, wearing a loose tee and sweats. Tucker didn't remember the other man's name, and despite the other man's notably sturdier build and the fact that Tucker was on his 3rd fight of the day, while his opponent was completely fresh, Tucker wasn't worried. Wary, maybe, but not worried, and his opponent could tell. He was hesitant to attack. The 2 locked eyes, energy literally sparked between them as nature itself anticipated their clash. Tucker had no idea what his opponent's abilities might be, while his opponent had seen Tucker fight many times. So of course the obvious move for Tucker to make was to wait for his opponent to strike first and get a feel for his movements. Instead, Tucker, bored with waiting, did the exact opposite. He rushed at his opponent and threw a very direct right hook. His opponent ducked easily to the side, Tucker's fist sailing past his ear, leaving his torso wide open. His opponent struck twice in rapid succession, pummeling Tucker in the ribs. Tucker gasped as the air was knocked from his lungs, and he doubled over. His opponent drew back and kicked him in the face, knocking him backward. He stumbled, but managed to remain standing. Tucker's opponent was surprised. He'd managed to score 2 solid hits against one of the best fighters in the area. His previous apprehension evaporating, he pressed what he saw as his advantage. He surged forward, his fists becoming wrapped in soft white light, and he wound up to attack again. He was surprised when Tucker looked up at him, smiling. Seemingly unfazed by the pain that he was undoubtedly feeling, Tucker moved so fast that his opponent could barely track his movements. He slipped into a better stance and deflected both of his opponent's jabs without much effort. He shuffled back, putting distance between himself and his opponent, and then, with less than a second to reestablish his footing, he lunged forward again. Puffs of smoke rose from where his feet touched the ground, and before his opponent could react, Tucker struck him twice in the chest, leaving his opponent stumbling desperately. Tucker pressed forward, turning in less time than it took his opponent to realize what was happening, and elbowed his opponent in the gut. Then he turned again, backhanding his opponent in the face. The sturdier young man was sent sprawling to the hard ground, Tucker standing over him, more bruised than before, but triumphant. "Oh yeah," Tucker exclaimed. "That's one more for the books. Any other takers?" He looked around at the small crowd that had gathered to watch the fight. Not one of them would meet his eyes, and most of them scattered until only a group of 1 girl and 2 guys remained, standing far off to the side and talking among themselves. Tucker grinned wide, prepared to call it a day. He was surprised when a familiar voice rang from behind him, saying, "I'll fight you, but we'll be late." Tucker turned to see Jo walking up to him, her hands pocketed casually, a stupid grin marking her face. Tucker grinned back. "No way, man. That'd take way too long." "And you'd lose," Jo goaded. Tucker's friendly smile changed, becoming competitive and fierce. "Oh, I don't think that we can be sure about that." For a second, it almost seemed like the 2 might actually take the time to fight it out, and that they'd enjoy themselves if they did. Instead, they had a good laugh together, and Jo waited as Tucker removed a pair of jeans from the bag, sitting off to the side of the court, slipped them on, and gathered up his things. The 2 walked together back toward the new park, talking and laughing. Neither of them had any idea just how closely they were being watched by the last 3 spectators. "That can't be them," one of the young men said to the others. He was the tallest of the group, with short brown hair and fierce hazel eyes, and a practiced scowl marring his hard yet handsome face. He stood there with his hands resting at his sides, but he didn't look at all relaxed. He seemed like the type who was always on edge, always ready in case he was attacked, and always ready to attack back. "Why is that?" the second of the group, the second young man, asked. He was as much the opposite of his male companion as he reasonably could be. Where the first young man was dressed casually in a dragon print t-shirt and khakis, the second young man wore a pressed white button-up shirt under a purple vest and black pants. His hair was long, wrapping his face. He was far less tense and spoke calmly in contrast to his companion's overt harshness. "You saw the red-headed one fight," the first young man answered, scoffing at the mention of Tucker. "He doesn't hold a candle to any of us." "He was pretty clearly holding back," the second young man replied. "We didn't see him use energy from his soul once, even to defend against his opponent's energized attack. And don't forget, there are 2 more of them in their group who are supposed to be roughly as strong as the 2 we saw." "2 more or 20 more, the first man argued. "It wouldn't matter. All 4 of them could be 10 times that strong, and I could still beat them on my own." That's when the final of the 3 spoke up. Like the other 2, she was about Joe and Tucker's age. Her long brown hair flowed gracefully past her shoulder blades, a spattering of pale freckles adorned the nose and cheeks of her pretty face. She hadn't once looked away from the 2 departing figures. Even now, as they crossed into the tree line, she kept her gaze fixed in their direction, anticipation pulling at her lips. "And yet," she said, "our leader has his eye on them. He went to the trouble of sending us to assess their strength. There must be something special about them." She looked back at the others. Neither of them argued with her, and they had halted their own argument when she had spoken. They looked back at her, waiting for her to continue, ready to defer to her. "We'll know more after their match, obviously," she said curiously. "But I don't think we should take these 4 lightly. I get the feeling that they're more than they seem." She turned once again to look at the place where the 2 had disappeared into the trees, hoping for one last glimpse at not Tucker, but the one who had come to meet him. Joe and Tucker made the short trip to the nearest bus stop in almost no time. Unfortunately, as it turned out, they were still going to be late. The bus showed up a whole 20 minutes later than it should have. The 2 of them didn't really mind. No one expected them to be on time anyway. In the end, they arrived at their destination almost a half hour after they had planned. They made short work of another quick walk, finally coming upon an inconspicuous single-story house on a curved street. Just one of many similar structures. They would have knocked on the door, but there was no need. As they approached, it swung open, and a young woman, a couple of years younger than the 2 of them, stood waiting. It would be hard to tell that she was younger to someone he didn't know. Despite her relative youth, the girl was a little taller than Joe and nearly as tall as Tucker. She was solidly built, but not heavy. An onlooker might find her quite pretty, assuming that they appreciated her dark, lacy clothing, her heavy eye makeup, and the black and purple streaks in her hair. "You're late," the girl said, looking right at Joe. "Your sister's pissed." Then, with a smile, she looked past Joe at Tucker and said, "Hey, Tuck." "Hey, Jen." She led the 2 arrivals inside, through a modestly furnished living room. An even younger girl sat on the couch and waved at Jen and her visitors as they passed by, stepping down a staircase in the back of the house into a large finished basement. As they rounded the corner into the first and smaller of 2 rooms, which was furnished with a couch, a chair, and a TV, another girl immediately made herself known. It's hard to imagine that anyone so small could be so scary, and yet both of those words described this girl. She was slight of frame, but what muscles she had were well defined. The yellow jersey that she wore did nothing to hide her slim yet powerful arms. She stood there like a cobra coiled to strike. Her cute, youthful face looked unexpectedly hard, her shining blue eyes were fierce. Her full head of bouncy golden curls did nothing to soften her appearance. "You're late," she almost spat, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "I told you that I have somewhere else I need to be. You promised this wouldn't take long and that you'd be on time." "Sorry," Joe replied, shooting the girl the closest that she could to an apologetic smile while trying not to laugh. Joe was afraid of her sister. She was like an angry badger when she got like this. She had no restraint at all, and yet Joe still found her anger amusing. "Don't you sorry me," the girl replied harshly. "I can tell when you don't mean it." "Oh, come on, Sarah," Tucker said, speaking up from his place behind his friends. "It wasn't our fault. The bus was late." "You stay out of this, Tucker," Sarah snapped, and Tucker hid behind Joe's back. Sarah looked again at her sister. "You'd better hurry up and tell us what you got us together to tell us. If I hurry, I can still make practice." "That's actually the thing," Joe said awkwardly, like a woman walking on eggshells. "I was thinking that the 4 of us should train, for this weekend. So your plan all along was to get me here and convince me to miss practice to train with you," Sarah said. It was a statement, not a question. She sighed. Fine, I'll train. I'll train against you right now. Fight me. If you win, I'll stay and work with you and the others instead of going to practice. But when I win, I go, and you don't get to say a word. Joe frowned. Okay, fine. We'll have a heart-to-heart to decide if you stay and train with us. At the utterance of her words, sparks literally flew between the two of them. Jen and Tucker stepped back and watched as Joe and Sarah stepped into the second, larger basement room. This one had no furniture in it. The walls were blank, save for some wood paneling and a rack with some wooden swords and bow staves perched upon it. The two would-be combatants stepped to either end of the large mat that covered the floor. Sarah took up a ready stance, her feet close together and her arms tight to her body. Joe didn't bother to prepare herself outwardly at all, though Sarah could see that she was giving the fight her full attention. Sarah was the first to strike. By now, Jen and Tucker had made their way to the entrance of the room, and Sarah's movement across the mat was enough to stir their hair and clothing. Her strike was so fast that it could barely be seen, and yet her sister traced it with her eyes the entire time and avoided it with a carefully timed sidestep. The strike missed her by a centimeter. Sarah turned in place. Her movements were tight and controlled, reminiscent of a ballet dancer's, but with less flourish. She struck twice, more at her sister, and then 4 times more, and then 8, all in rapid succession. Her body twisted and turned, putting weight and momentum behind each blow, and yet Joe avoided every single one. Frustrated, Sarah turned on her heel. It was a risky maneuver, one that she had been practicing, but that she'd never used in an actual fight. She nearly lost her balance, but the maneuver paid off. Without having to regroup, she had moved herself back into position to press her attack. She caught her sister by surprise. Joe actually had to raise her arm and deflect the next strike rather than step out of the way. She was visibly taken aback, a look of excitement spreading across her face. Joe knocked Sarah's next barrage of even faster, heavier attacks away, and then stepped in close. Intending to end things quickly, she struck hard and fast at her sister's torso. She was surprised again when Sarah was able to twist once more and curl around her strike, coming in close with her own. Sarah couldn't believe it. She had managed to get inside her sister's guard. She had never managed to get inside her sister's guard before. Joe was just as surprised. It was plain on her face. Sarah had been training to improve the fluidity of her movements, and it had paid off. She was going to score a hit. Then, just before her fist could make contact, Joe was gone. That was really good, said Joe from her new place behind her sister. Sarah spun around to face Joe as she said, "You've almost completely overhauled your fighting style. You've got to work on your footwork. Someone can still hit you easily enough if they aimed low enough." "How did you move like that?" Sarah demanded. Joe smirked at her, the literal competitive energy arcing between them dissipating. "That's a secret, something that I plan on saving for the match. I'm really impressed that I had to use it on you. I guess you're ready for this weekend. You can go to soccer if you want." She meant it, and Sarah could tell that she did, but she wasn't having any of it. "No way," she exclaimed. "I'm staying. I'm going to keep practicing until I hit you." Joe laughed and looked to Jen and Tucker as well. "All right then, let's pair off." The 4 young fighters spent the rest of the evening sparring with each other. Sarah, too stubborn to go home until she'd scored a hit on her sister, did manage to do just that, but only because Joe was too stubborn to risk showing off her new technique again, as she put it, before it was time. Meanwhile, Jen soundly defeated Tucker multiple times, something that Tucker had come to expect, even if he did find it annoying. Before long, it was late in the evening, the sun falling steadily below the horizon, and all 4 fighters were tired, sore, and sweaty, even more so than usual. It was time for visitors to head home, and for all 4 to get a night's rest to recharge their batteries. Tucker would have to take the bus home, but Joe and Sarah weren't so unlucky. "Thanks again for the ride, Aunt Val," Joe told a middle-aged woman who resembled a plumper version of her own mother as she gathered up her car keys from the hook beside the front door. Joe waved over her shoulder one more time at her cousin Jen and made her way to the door. Tucker and Sarah were close behind. She was a little surprised when Jen stopped her. "Joe, wait a second," Jen exclaimed, asking, "Weren't we going to talk about our team name? I thought you needed one to finalize our application." "Oh," Joe said awkwardly, "about that. It turns out we ran out of time, so I had to come up with one of my own. I drew a logo for us and everything." Jen, Sarah, and Tucker all groaned in unison. "Yeah," Sarah said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Just wait until you hear this." Joe scoffed at her. "Hey, it's a good name. Memorable and dynamic. Just wait. Before long, everyone will know it. From this day forward, the 4 of us will be known as Team Dueling Hearts."